Okay, my clock reads 1 minute past the hour, so I think we'll get started there. And a very big welcome and hello to all of you for joining us for today's webinar, The Leadership Challenges of a Hybrid Working Model. I was having a little look through the participant list as you were all dialing in, and it's so nice to welcome back so many familiar names. So great to see you. I'm afraid too many to name right now, but it's lovely to see you all. And I also noticed quite a few new names on that list. So it's lovely to meet you. Thank you for joining us and for spending this next hour, lunch hour perhaps, with us. For those who are new, hi Phyllis, for those who are new to the School for CEOs, perhaps I can start with a brief introduction to the school before I hand over to today's presenters. So the School for CEOs turned 10 later this year. And over the last 10 years, we've been supporting senior executives, including CEOs, executive leaders, and also aspiring executive leaders through a mixture of different interventions, from one-to-one coaching through to consolidated leadership programs, and also through reverse mentoring programs as well. Our ethos is very much built around practitioner-led insights, so very pragmatic learning that is delivered in a very personal way. Today's webinar is an evolution of a series that we put together last year, Leadership and Survival, which was developed to help support you with the very current challenges of lockdown and COVID-19, looking at both the people leadership challenges, but also the business leadership challenges. It was very much about adapting and surviving, but here we are now 15 or so months later, we're now thinking about planning forward and actually trying to explore what a sustainable working looks like for us. We now know we don't need to be in the office to work effectively, but we're starting to ask ourselves what good looks like and what is best practice now. So this is probably a good time to introduce our presenters for today. We have leading today's presentation, David Soul, who is managing partner and co-founder of the School for CEOs. Hello, David.
Hi, Gemma.
And also joining him, we have Colin Daniel, who is partner at School for CEOs. Hi, Colin.
Hi, Gemma. Hello, everyone.
Together, David and Colin are going to be highlighting some very specific leadership challenges around this hybrid working model. They'll also be reflecting on different approaches to hybrid working, while offering guidance and support through a slightly different leadership framework. My name's Gemma, and I'm a partner at School for CEOs and hosting today's webinar. So final little bit of housekeeping before I pass you over. This presentation will be around 35 to 40 minutes, and we've made sure that there'll be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So if you would like to ask questions at any point, you can do this through the Q&A function. And when you're asking a question, if you'd like to remain anonymous in asking your question, just tick the anonymous box as you submit that. If you would like to send a message to the panelists, the best way to do this is through the chat and direct your message in the drop-down option to panelists, and that will come through to David, Colin, and myself. I'll be keeping an eye on that as well. We have one poll for you later on, so keep an eye out for that and do take part. And finally, we're going to be turning our videos off for the main presentation, but we'll be coming back on later for the Q&A. It's just to give you a nice clean screen to look at. So that's everything from me. I'd now like to hand you over to David. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Gemma. And I'm going to turn my video off. Well, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. It feels slightly surreal that this time last year we did our first two webinars entitled Leadership and Survival, looking at how to manage through the emerging pandemic. But today we're tackling an issue that has emerged as a consequence of the crisis, the new term hybrid working and the leadership challenges associated with a relatively new working model. So we'd like to look at hybrid working, what it means, the pros and cons and the various different models, the key issues that we feel organizations should be addressing, and finally, considering the leadership challenges through the lens of our dimensions model. Now, I'm delighted that I'm going to be joined by Colin Daniel today. Colin is a partner here at the School for CEOs and has extensive coaching experience, in particular working with clients in our runway program, which revolves around the dimensions framework, which we'll touch on later. So Colin has some very relevant experience. Colin, before we get going, is there anything that has struck you in the conversations you've been having with leaders over the last few months as we've begun to move more towards hybrid working?
Thanks, David. I think the feedback I'm hearing from my coaching clients and client organizations at the moment is, a familiar question. How can you live your culture when you're not living in your culture? So things are very different now than they were 12 months, 15 months ago, where there was a rush, if you like, a nerve-sightedness, a rush to keep the show on the road. And we embraced a very different way of working, some of us very quickly. Perhaps that rhythm is not sustainable, and what we created back then suited us for a while, but might not be what we need to maintain as we go forward. So what worked in the past might not work in the future. And I've also noticed, David, that there's been a return to some 19th century technology. People are returning to phone calls. So Zoom fatigues and a return to conversations on the phone.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice to actually talk to people. Reminds me of an old BT advert. Okay, thanks, Colin. We'll hear more from you later on. Before we get going, some of you who were on our very first webinar around 12 months ago may recall that we ran a poll which asked you how long the COVID crisis would last. And we thought we'd remind you with what you thought then. Clearly, we had a lot of optimists on the session a year ago, with 83% reckoning that it would all be over by Christmas. Well, hopefully we're beginning to see some light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccine rollout and things beginning to return to some degree of normality. But there is still a way to go. But let's move on. I think it's important to define what we mean by hybrid working, as the term is applied to any sort of flexible approach. Indeed, many consider the current working from home under the lockdown restrictions to be hybrid working. But for the purposes of today, we would define the hybrid working model as a location flexible arrangement, allowing employees to combine on-site and off-site work as they and their employers see fit. As lockdowns are lifted, a wide range of hybrid working arrangements have emerged, giving employees flexibility that was rare before the pandemic. In a recent survey of over 1,000 UK-based full-time employees by HiBob, the HR software firm, they found 4 different hybrid working models being offered to employees: at will, split week, shift work, and week by week. The at-will model enables the employees to choose their own work arrangement that works best for them on any given day, blending work from home and office work to suit them and their circumstances. The split week model splits the working week between office and home on a more structured basis. For example, working from home 2 days and working in the office the remaining 3. This enables teams to come together on a more frequent and regular basis and provides a bit more structure to the working week. In the third model, employees work in shifts, alternating working from home and working morning or evening shifts on site. Now, this is proving more challenging for employees, particularly those who have to put in place childcare arrangements. And the fourth model sees employees alternating working from home and working in the office on a week-by-week basis. There are a number of pros and cons of hybrid working, but we focused on 3 on each side of the equation. On the plus side, organizations will undoubtedly be able to reduce their cost base. In a recent survey undertaken by the property firm CBRE, they discovered that 39% of tenants in office accommodation were either contracting their office footprint, consolidating offices, or making plans to exit their properties. The office of the future will also look very different to pre-lockdown. We know that many of the new fit-outs have less desk space, more meeting rooms and collaboration areas, and all occupying less square footage than pre-pandemic. There's also been a shift from presenteeism to productivity. Since lockdown, organizations have become more agile and adaptable, and the focus has been on outputs rather than process. With colleagues having to work remotely in the main, businesses have paid attention to what colleagues have been able to produce from a work perspective, rather than worrying about how they produce it. With caring or homeschooling responsibilities, working parents have had to adapt and fit work around other important commitments. And so long as the work gets done, that's fine. And that has meant that bosses have had to trust their teams far more than ever before. Leaders have also been brought into the living areas of their colleagues and have developed a far greater idea of the challenges and environment that they have to work in. Consequently, they've become far more accommodating, in the most part, and inclusive and engaging than perhaps they would have been in an office environment where none of their colleagues' contexts are apparent. There are cons, however. We know that mental health has been a huge issue over the past 12 months. That it has been brought into sharper focus is a positive generally, but the relative lack of regular social contact remains an issue, and hybrid working takes away habitual interactions where not only do individuals benefit from the connections, but it also provides an opportunity to check in on colleagues. The virtual arm around the shoulder is no substitute for one-to-one time. Organizational culture is also at risk, as Colin mentioned, from hybrid working practices. Cultures are embedded by consistent behaviors as demonstrated by the organization's leaders. Visibility and role modeling of these behaviors becomes critical to hardwiring the DNA of organizational culture. If you only see your leaders on a part-time basis, this embedding of behavior becomes even harder, particularly if leaders ease up on their visibility as we return to more normal times. And will clients receive the same degree of care and attention in a hybrid working environment? Everyone has been very accommodating during the enforced lockdowns as the expectation of face-to-face time has disappeared. There's a risk that organizations become complacent in a hybrid working model and don't focus enough on their customers and clients, whoever they might be. Customer expectations may increase as we emerge to the new normal, and organizations who don't adapt to this could suffer. Now, there have been a number of surveys recently on hybrid working, so perhaps we can explore our own audience's view of this. How many days do you expect to work in the office? And let's assume that things get back to a degree of normality in the autumn with offices opening up and transport infrastructure getting back to usual. So Gemma, if we can launch the poll, please. Will you work from home all the time? Or do you expect to work in the office full time again? If you're adopting hybrid working, how many days do you expect to work in the office compared to at home?
Last 5 seconds. Okay, I'll close that and share now.
Thanks, Gemma. So we've got 33% at 2 days, 28% at 3 days, 6% working from home all the time, 16 and 6. So 2 recent surveys, one by consultancy Eden McCallum and the second by the Institute of Directors, showed quite contrasting results, and they're up on the slide behind the poll results. As you can see, the IOD had more working both full-time at home and full-time in the office, while Eden McCallum had the majority of their respondents, 2/3, working two or three days in the office. And that sort of correlates with our results here. What have we got? 61%, so almost 2/3 working 2 or 3 days in the office. a slightly lower proportion either going full-time at home or full-time in the office. What's certain is that there's little appetite to return to pre-pandemic working models for a number of reasons, and that because organizations have been able to continue to function effectively in a working from home environment, leaders are much more open to considering and implementing more flexible working arrangements, not least because the cost of doing so is considerably less than their IT departments had indicated it might have been. Surveys by Boston Consulting Group identified 4 key building blocks to support the new hybrid working models that we're beginning to engage with. And it's the first of those building blocks that resonates the most with us, that of leadership, culture, and purpose. We'll come back to leadership and culture in a moment, but purpose-led organizations have become amongst the most admired and most effective, irrespective of the pandemic. The why of an organization becomes an anchor or foundation upon which everything else is built. Vision, mission, and values all emerge from clarity of purpose, and embedding this in decision-making brings it all to life. Only last week on our Vital Few program, we had a number of CEOs talking about the importance of their purpose and how everything stems from that. Strategy, the what, and values, the how, both come behind the clarity of purpose, the why of the organization. This has become increasingly important in the modern organization, not least because of the focus on sustainability and ethics. And we know that purpose supports resilience, both at an organizational and individual level, so it is increasingly important. We're going to turn our attention to the challenges of leadership in a hybrid working model. And to facilitate this, I'd like to consider it through the lens of our dimensions model. Managing up, forming the right relationship with your boss and other key stakeholders. Managing down, leading both your immediate team and the wider organization. Managing out, working with stakeholders outside your organization. Managing in, keeping your feet on the ground. And managing across, getting your peer relationships right. Clearly, we'll only touch on a few themes on each dimension, but working on the basis that less is more, hopefully we can pick up on any other areas that you'd like to explore in the Q&A session. One of the critical areas that often derails relationships is the inability to set and agree clear expectations, both in terms of objectives and deliverables, but also in relation to how you work with your colleagues and boss. This has undoubtedly become more challenging in a hybrid working model, as the focus has shifted onto output and productivity, and one-to-one face time can become irregular. Which brings me on to the second theme, which is that of communication, and which clearly runs through all of the dimensions, but particularly those of managing up and down. We noticed that many leaders dialed up their communication when colleagues were in lockdown. The need and urgency of reassurance, direction, and moral support was acute, and in the main, people excelled at this. Engagement scores improved in organizations. Messages were transparent, and despite a lack of physical contact, communication was excellent. Moving into hybrid working, there's a risk that complacency sets in. And as people return to an office environment, the attention paid to communication diminishes. Assumptions that a message is communicated in person may neglect those who happen to be working from home. And this is particularly important in managing up. Maintaining that open channel is critical. Whether you're in the office or working from home, you can't afford to overlook the need to communicate. And this is even more critical for you as you seek to continue on your career journey. It's not only your boss who is key, but their peer group as well. So managing up and then across is essential to ensure you and your professional brand are well known. The slightly random nature of the hybrid working model is going to add a layer of complexity to this as individuals adopt different working patterns. So your stakeholder map needs to be continually refined and updated to ensure you're having the right conversations with the right people and not missing anyone out. Colin, I'm sure this is featured in your conversations with clients a fair bit.
Yeah, it does, David. Managing up, interestingly, is the least highest scored dimension on our runway program. The runway program, we ask our delegates to self-assess their performance against, or their activity against, the 5 dimensions that you've mentioned. And managing up has always been the lowest scored, and that hasn't changed during the period of time of lockdown. So managing up still is the lowest self-reported, and the one that needs most development and activity if you're looking to step up. And previously, we managed up through these set piece meetings, those regular meetings that we have with our bosses and their peers. And those were often face to face, and now they're not. They're now on Zoom. And the way that we used to manage up in conversations prior to those formal set pieces were the occasional, I'll meet you for a coffee before we go into that meeting, or I'd like to air this idea with you. We now need to find different ways of doing that. So that stakeholder management piece you talked about, the refinement of the map, is absolutely critical. And that's the piece that most people appear to be working on at the moment. I think a message from the faculty that speak on our programs is ask, reach up to the people above you, and ask for support and assistance. People are very willing to talk, and that communication that you mentioned, David, is very much at the fore at the moment. But when you're asking for help, also ask for feedback, and be very specific about what feedback is you're looking for. Make it easy for your boss to know what you're up to, and be open. Be open with your boss, they'll be open back.
Great, thanks, Colin. The sense of belonging is a fundamental human need, and so inclusion is a key quality in leaders and organizations. In many respects, lockdown forced leaders to pay more attention to the circumstances and context that their colleagues were experiencing, as we were literally in their homes, seeing children climbing onto knees, hearing dogs barking, or getting a sense of their working environment, whether that was in a home office at best, or propping up a laptop on an ironing board at worst. As we transition to hybrid working models, leaders need to hone their emotional intelligence and think hard about how to ensure that everyone feels included. As partly formed teams come together, it may be easy to forget the teammate who's working from home that day, but their feeling of exclusion may be amplified if you don't reach out to connect to them. And beware the politicized workplace. There's a risk that cliques might form of those who are in the office on certain days regularly. They might have lunch together or go for a drink after work. And very quickly, those working from home become part of an out crowd, as opposed to being in the in crowd. Leaders need to be aware of this phenomenon emerging and ensure it doesn't become an issue for those who've chosen to spend more time working from home. And hybrid working, by its very nature, is going to be different for everyone. Yet we perform at our best when we have some degree of routine. Whether we know we're at our most creative early in the morning, or that we need to avoid long, boring meetings straight after lunch in case we fall asleep in them, having some sort of routine is helpful. You need to develop routines that play to your needs while still accommodating the needs of others, whether those are your daily routines or weekly routines. Developing a good working rhythm for team meetings, one-to-one sessions, or just the days that you travel to the office will be helpful to you and your team, and it will increase your productivity and well-being. Colin, what have you noticed about the most effective leaders from a managing down perspective?
Most effective leaders have always been good at building connections. They network incredibly well, but they really maintain that close connection with their team members and colleagues. And that's been tough. As you say, they're entering into people's rooms and houses via Zoom and Teams is a very different thing, but it's changed some of the conversation. So apart from it being perhaps an HR-led process of checking in so many times a year against objectives, performance setting, and so on and so forth, it's becoming much more of a conversation. I think people are getting to know their people better. So making sure that as we move into hybrid, that feeling of being included and known remains important. There's been great stories of firms adopting things like Google Hangouts so that their teams can go into a Hangout and just create some connection with colleagues as they would normally do around the office desk. And that's been a fantastic thing to do. As we move into hybrid, though, there's very much the sort of in crowd and the out crowd. The in crowd of those being in the office space, the out crowd being those that are still working from home or other places. And large multinationals have been really good at managing that connection in those types of environment very well in the past. So I think the people I speak to, not surprisingly, it's those larger organizations that have experience of that can see their way forward for the future. And what they're thinking of doing is using Zoom continually, even though people might still be in the office. So everybody is still in the office, is still using Zoom to maintain that feeling of inclusion using the Zoom or MS Teams model. Others are actually recording team meetings. If I'm unable to get to it because my children are on self-isolation or I've got some caring responsibilities, I can pack up on the Teams event by watching the recording of the team meeting. So I think that's important too. But great leaders are also modeling boundaries. What is appropriate and what isn't. They're being careful about when they message, what time of the day or night they're messaging, and what their expectations are from their teams.
Great, thanks, Colin. It's worth giving some consideration to how your customer journeys are evolving in a hybrid working environment. We know that the amount of business travel halved during 2020 and that it's expecting to grow slowly back, around 21% this year, but not reaching pre-pandemic levels until the middle of the decade. Lockdown forced us to work in a certain way, and client and customer interactions were very different to pre-lockdown. Hybrid working will undoubtedly lead to more face-to-face meetings, but smart organizations will be very focused on how they can interact with their customers and clients, not only to take advantage of the cost efficiencies, but also making it an optimum solution for the client. There's also the aspect of employer brand. How do you want to be known in the new world? Organizations will have to think carefully about how they want to be perceived by employees, and particularly by the talent that they would like to attract to work with them. Once again, purpose-led organizations will have an edge, and those who adopt the most appealing hybrid working models should benefit. After all, in a world where presenteeism is valued far less than productivity, organizations can become geographically agnostic about their employees and hire the best wherever they are, notwithstanding the obvious challenges that we've already pointed out. And of course, with hybrid working models and an increasing dependency on technology to enable the working from home environment, there's a growing threat of cybercrime. Globally, 30,000 websites are hacked every day. In the UK, one small business is successfully hacked every 19 seconds, according to Hiscox, the insurer. 64% of companies worldwide have experienced at least one form of cyber attack, and worldwide spending on cybersecurity management is expected to reach in excess of $133 billion by 2022, with operational technology being a prime target. Cyber issues are only going to get worse. And as our dependency on technology increases in a hybrid working model, preparing for cyber attacks is essential. Colin, your views on managing out?
I think there's a paradox in the customer contact piece. I've been coaching over the last year a number of corporate and commercial bankers, and their customer contact has increased immeasurably as they assist clients through liquidity crises of early lockdown, and managing the government support schemes and so on and so forth. So I think there's a paradox in play in that many leaders are perhaps spending even more time than they normally would with customers, ironically. And I think going forward, the days of us all gathering together, nursing our warm glass of Chardonnay as we network and meet people from outside our organizations, that's going to change. And we now need to understand really where the tribe we're looking to hang out with are meeting, now that perhaps not meeting physically. So the event space is changing dramatically. So where do we now need to be to catch up with the people who bring us the outside into our thinking and leadership? So keep auditing your external network. That seems to me to be a piece of work well worth investing time in. And on your point, David, on cyber, I was interested to read on the BBC only a couple of days ago that many of us are now continuing to use out-of-date routers, which cause problems for potential cyber attack. So it's a very real risk.
Thanks, Colin. We've all been acutely aware of the mental health crisis that has emerged as a consequence of lockdown. And this isn't going to go away quickly. Regrettably, it's here to stay for a while yet. What it has done has brought into greater focus the issue of mental well-being, and more conversations are being had about the subject, which is the critical first step. Yet there's still a risk that employees suffer from isolation in the world of hybrid working. We talked about the in and out crowd earlier, and this is a very real threat. We need to take individual responsibility for taking care of ourselves. Remember the safety briefing, fit your own mask first before helping others. If we aren't fit mentally and physically, we aren't much good to anyone. And we've talked about resilience before on previous webinars. There have been lots of good suggestions and proposals to help boost resilience, and now is not the time to return to them. What we would propose is that you consider our 3 E's: educate, engage, and explore. Educate yourself on 2 levels. First, understand yourself better. And second, understand burnout and stress better. What are the situations and environments that you feel most challenged in? When does stress become distress for you? What are your triggers? Secondly, engage. This means asking for help or simply talking about things. In talking, you're beginning to process your thoughts and emotions in a more cognitive way, which enables you to address them more effectively. And finally, explore. Explore different ways to promote good psychological well-being. Explore techniques and tools that could help build personal resilience. It is possible to develop. And finally, purpose. I've talked about purpose and the importance of purpose before, so I don't really want to dwell any longer on this, other than to say that if you do choose to explore purpose, be prepared to get stuck in doing so. But working through it is very worthwhile. Colin, some points from managing in from your perspective.
I'd like to pick up on your final point there, David, on purpose. So on our runway program, where people assess themselves against the dimensions model, we have a session on purpose within the managing in dimension. And I think that when I reflect on the last 12 months, those conversations are now getting deeper and longer than they ever have done when we've discussed purpose. So leaders are identifying that this is an area that they are looking to develop. They're looking to develop that individual sense of purpose and identity. So I think there's a tie-in, it's probably to managing out as well in terms of personal identity and brand. But the conversations I'm having are deeper and, as I say, much more thought-provoking than I've noticed previously. And what people, go on. Sorry, David.
That's okay.
And so what people are doing is really trying to improve their attentional focus and manage those internal and external cognitive interruptions. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. And finally, we move to managing across. And there may be a need to redefine how we collaborate in a hybrid working model. If full teams can't always come together as one, how can you engage with colleagues who are working from home or working remotely when there are others in a meeting room? We know that the design of offices is becoming more attuned to flexible working spaces, more meeting rooms and collaboration areas. But how will these work in practice? Will leaders mandate that you're present on certain days for certain meetings, or is there another way? This again highlights the need for truly inclusive leadership, to take into account everyone's circumstances and preferences before arriving at a conclusion. I've highlighted conflict as a potential watch out on the managing across dimension. With a redefined model for collaboration and hopefully more inclusive workplaces, the potential for conflict to increase exists. So there's something about becoming more comfortable with it. Recognizing that it isn't personal, but instead stems from an ambition to do the right thing or the better thing for the business is essential. So in managing peer relationships, creating a psychologically safe space for conflict to exist in an environment of high trust between colleagues is a must-have. And finally, bridging. Bridging is a term coined by an academic from IAC Business School in Spain, and it relates to the behavior leaders enact to create meaningful connections and therefore powerful collaborations. It will become an essential capability to master to enable leaders to connect across physical distance, between distinct cultures, and within new organizational models. All three hallmarks of the hybrid working model. Colin, your views on managing across?
You mentioned right at the beginning, David, on managing up, the importance to kind of refresh and review that stakeholder map. And those people who I've been talking to over the last year or so, who are managing across really well. And incidentally, this is probably the highest score, is the highest scoring dimension that we see, and we've consistently seen that through the last 12 months too. What they do really well is to refresh their wider internal stakeholder network. They're identifying who they need to speak with, how frequently they need to speak with. But what they're doing supremely well at the moment is finding informal ways, informal opportunities for people in their teams to collaborate and work together. And linking to organizational purpose, the why are we here? What is it we're here to do? There's been a sharp focus, and perhaps organizations have seen a drop from a big wish list of topics they want to achieve. They've finessed that and gone down to smaller lists of items that must be delivered over this past 12 months. And that narrower focus, that laser-like focus, is allowing people to really come together under a common purpose.
Thanks, Colin. Make no mistake, hybrid working is here to stay. The last 12 months have proved that colleagues can be trusted to deliver high-quality work without having to be in an office. Yet the requirement for social interactions and new styles of collaboration are still in demand, So the need for offices hasn't quite disappeared yet. Organizations have a responsibility to be clear about what their working model will be post-pandemic. In recent research by McKinsey, 47% of employees felt that a lack of clear vision about work in the post-pandemic world is a cause for concern, which is an incredibly high proportion of the workforce. To make the most of hybrid working will require leaders to be thoughtful and adaptable yet again. They cannot rely on what has served them well during the last 12 months being enough to work in the coming months and years. Being thoughtful about their own leadership brand, perhaps viewing it through the lens of the 5 dimensions, may be helpful. Culture is still king, however, and when allied to a purpose-led business, these are 2 cornerstones for success. However, with the ambiguity that hybrid working models are likely to create, leaders will have to work doubly hard on culture to ensure that it is fit for the future. Role modeling has always been important in helping to drive cultural change or to embed culture in a business, and doing this in a hybrid working model will be challenging, but not impossible. Thank you. Gemma, I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you, David. We're going to begin the Q&A shortly, but just before we do, I'm going to launch one final poll for you, just a closing poll. This is if you are interested in having a conversation with any of us to learn a little bit more about School for CEOs, or have a conversation about some of the dimensions that we've discussed. So feel free to participate in that. If none of them are relevant to you right now, then I think you can just click the X in the corner, and I'll bring that down in a second. I'm going to bring down the participant share, and I'd like to kick off the questions with one that came in just now from Graham. So if I read it out, a dominant theme throughout the pandemic has been the focus around working from home, which is now migrating towards the hybrid working model. Another dominant theme has been the positive recognition for frontline workers, who are often the commercial backbone of an enterprise rather than support functions or overhead. How do you encourage leaders to effectively balance this paradox in working arrangements across the different employee populations within an organization? How do we maintain the higher moral stance we've discovered towards those on organizations' front lines? Great question, Graham. Thank you for that. David, would you like to answer that first?
Thanks, Gemma, and thanks, Graham, for the question. I think it's a really great question, and I think one thing that I think organizations have done really well during the pandemic. We talked about it, the engagement scores increasing, communication increasing, creating a sense of certainty and anchors in what has been an incredibly uncertain 12 months. Has been done exceptionally well in many organizations. And I think that the risk is that you lose sight of this. So it's almost dialing up things around values, cultures, behavior, rather than actually becoming complacent because you have that face-to-face time. And I think focusing even more attention on this in a hybrid working model rather than less attention on it is the right thing to do to ensure that you're really engaging and communicating and including employees, whether they are frontline people or the ones sort of keeping the score in the back office. And that sort of sense of equality and equity and justice is really, really important. So trying to take away any barriers or perceptions that may have built up or been pre-existing anyway between frontline staff and colleagues and back office staff and colleagues is a really important thing to be working on.
Thank you. Colin, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, thanks. I'm struck by difference that I've heard from different organizations and different CEOs. I've spoken to one CEO where he said to his top team, you are not going into the plant. that we need to protect the workers that are in the plant. So all the time this is going on, I don't want any of you in the plant. I've then seen another organization where the leadership has said, no, our frontline workers are in, so you need to be in, socially distanced, all the careful things put in place. So there's been a difference, but there's been an intentionality about it. And they were able to explain to me why they'd taken those differing routes. But the one that speaks to me most on this topic is one of the leaders in hospitality trade, who, just as England was reopening, went out. And he went out to see those frontline workers in the restaurants and bars that he runs within his region. And almost to a person, they said, we never expected to see you out and about. So the being there and being supportive of those key workers at the time when we came back out, I think needs to be maintained as we move into hybrid. You've got to be seen, you've got to be visible, you need to be intentional.
Thank you, Colin. Questions come in just now from Donna. 2 points raised earlier. 1, maintaining routines is important. Does this mean that in office days should be consistent? Is there guidance around how to structure the hybrid working model in this respect? 2, recording team meetings so that team members can watch later. This feels riskier in that it could lead to meeting attendance engagement issues, and also raises data privacy issues if employees do not want to be recorded, plus the logistics around properly storing, archiving, deleting recordings. Is there additional context for this guidance? So 2 questions there. Perhaps you'd like to start with the first one around routines. I don't know, Colin, if you'd like to take that one first.
Yeah, I think rhythms. Most of our organizational lives are led by kind of rhythms. And I find that fascinating. So team meetings are always held on a certain day at a certain time, and that's always been the case. I would be sort of challenging some rhythm at the moment. Does it work for everybody? Does meeting at this time of the day mean that so and so can't actually get to pick their child up from school? Will they always be late because they've got drop off? In the past, that perhaps didn't worry us too much. It probably should have done, but it didn't. So really working out amongst the team what the rhythms would be, and I would have a sort of collective approach to that.
Mm-hmm. And David, would you like to build on that?
Yeah, I think there's something about understanding whether your routines are to serve you or to serve others. And I think the point I was trying to make was actually it's really important that you put in place routines to serve you. Now, whether you mandate or decide that you're going to work Tuesdays and Wednesdays in the office, that's fine, if that's what you choose to do and that's what suits your working life and environment. And then there's a piece around how does that work to other people's routines? Because if you're planning a team meeting on Thursday, can you accommodate and can you break your routine? Is that okay? So I think there's a lot of negotiation, and it comes back to that point about being inclusion and really being inclusive and really understanding everybody's context. You may have terrific reasons for choosing Tuesday and Wednesday, and there may be a terrific reason for choosing Thursday for the team meeting, but there's some sort of negotiation to be open about, well, what are those reasons? Why is it important? And how do you accommodate you? But the point is to create routine to serve you first and then others. And I think the point about recording team meetings, I absolutely get the point that Donna makes there. And if I'm perfectly honest, my preference would not be to record a team meeting, because I think some of the risks that you point out are very valid. Notwithstanding that, we've learned over the last 12 months, 15 months in lockdown, that we can trust people and that we can trust people to perform. And so, is this a sort of sense of almost mistrust and actually that drive towards presenteeism again, which perhaps is not a step forward? I think that point about trust in employees and focus on productivity is really important. So if they miss a team meeting, does it matter that much? So long as they're still able to perform and feel part of the team and not feel excluded.
Thank you. I'd like to move to Claire's question, or an observation rather than a question. So thank you, Claire. We found increasingly that we need to remind managers and team leaders of the professional relationships with their teams, because they're holding meetings basically in people's homes, and the relationships are sometimes running onto more personal and friendships, and conversations are falling into chats that you might have with friends. So managers need to be very careful they're not using language or discussing topics they wouldn't generally have done so in the office. What are your reflections on this? Because we have had a lot of conversations with leaders about almost complaining about their team members becoming a bit too relaxed, and some of the body language, perhaps the dress code becoming informal. On where is that line, and how do you build a bit of clarity around that? So Colin, would you like to share any reflections on that?
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. I think there's a similarity in a period of my own career going back over sort of 4 decades or so, where some of those conversations probably took place, but they took place on a Friday evening in a local hostelry at about 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night. So I think some of this stuff is just always been there, but is now emerging, but just in a different format or in a different space. So I don't doubt that they're there. I think in many cases they always were. And I think the word that Claire used in the observation was this one of professionalism. So a reminder of kind of where boundaries should be set. So I mentioned earlier about role modeling, but there's role modeling in our boundaries too. We don't talk like that. We don't behave like that. Zoom's an extension of the workplace as much as the pub was an extension of my workplace.
And interesting that that home culture, if you are working from home, that is the culture that might start to dominate. And how does that influence your behavior and the way you feel at work? But David, I interrupted you there.
No, it's okay. I was just going to pick up the point. It is about culture. So it is about redefining or finessing an organizational culture to take account of actually what values, behaviors do you want in your organization, and I guess part of that, to Colin's point, is actually what's okay to talk about and what isn't okay to talk about, and back to that point about inclusion. People need to, you want to create that sense of belonging, and that'll be different for different people. So you've got to explore that in a sensitive way to try and understand it a little bit better.
Mm-hmm. And so let's come back to the dimensions. So we went through each of the 5 dimensions, and Colin, you made a couple of references to areas where leaders tend to self-assess themselves less highly. What do you think has been the most challenging dimension for leaders when they consider hybrid working models? Colin? I
think put some context around this. What are the top scoring dimension, but by a fair stretch, is that of managing across. Mm-hmm. And people are still able to manage across well. It's the way that we work amongst our internal organizational network. The challenging one has always been up, and that's been made harder. So people are having to be extra intentional about the way they manage up, the way they create opportunity to talk to their boss, their boss's boss, their boss's peers, and doing it in a way that is supportive of the organization, and not being seen as being, if you like, Machiavellian, or in your approach. So I would say that they still remain, two that are particularly stretched. Managing out has always been one that people sort of step into doing more managing out as they go through their hierarchy. But those of us that are already involved in customer interaction are finding that we're having to do maybe more of that than we have done before.
And David, what do you feel is based on your coaching conversations, the dimension that leaders are finding most challenging?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think hybrid models are emergent, because they're not quite back into the office in the same way or and same degree of scale as perhaps we might be maybe 3 or 4 months down the line. And I think that whole piece of role modeling, setting the culture, how do you bring the values of your organization to life it's sort of working from home and it's sort of working from the office, but it's neither one or the other. When you were in the office, it was easier to sort of be a role model. And when you're working from home, it was easier to role model the communication. And as I said, engagement scores went up. I think when you get into that mixed model, that role modeling, the driving the culture, so the managing down piece, but it affects all dimensions really. When you're talking about cultures, how do you demonstrate that and bring those values to life and make sure that everybody gets it? And that plays back to the point around inclusion. So I'm fudging the question. I'm coming back to culture.
Very non-committal.
Yeah, being the issue, but it works on all 4 of the dimensions. So certainly up, down, and across, because it's such an important thing. And that is the one single piece which I think leaders really need to focus on and pay attention to, and dial up rather than dial down.
And I think you mentioned earlier, but really interesting how prominent that was as a theme that we discussed on our Vital Few program last week, the importance of having a clear purpose and organization-led values that underpin that purpose and that strategic vision for the business. We are getting close to the hour now, so I'm going to wrap up, but just a final thank you to everyone for joining us, and also to David and Colin for your insights today. So thank you very much. It's Friday, so we're nearly at the weekend. Enjoy, I hope it stays dry, and we look forward to welcoming you back at another webinar in the near future. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Gemma.
Thank you, Gemma.